Sir, that seat doesn't belong to you anymore. The sentence landed across the quiet first-class cabin with the confidence of someone who had never expected to be questioned. Heads turned almost instantly. A woman in an elegant cream blazer had settled into seat 2A, carefully placing her designer handbag beside the window, as though she had always intended to sit there. Emily Dawson crossed one leg over the other, glanced briefly at the boarding pass in the tall black man's hand, and smiled without warmth. "Find another seat," she added, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I'm already comfortable." The cabin, moments earlier filled with the gentle hum of overhead vents and quiet conversations, seemed to hold its breath. Marcus Carter stopped beside the row without showing the slightest hint of anger. He wore dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a plain black t-shirt beneath a lightweight jacket. Nothing about him suggested private security, celebrity status, or the executive suite. To most eyes, he looked like another traveler hoping to make a cross-country flight from Chicago to Los Angeles before sunset. He glanced once at the seat number above Emily's shoulder, then back at the boarding pass in his hand, confirming what he already knew. Seat 2A. His seat. "I believe you're sitting in the wrong place," Marcus said calmly, his voice steady enough that several nearby passengers leaned in rather than away. Emily laughed softly, shaking her head as if she were humoring a child. "That's adorable," she replied. "People try this all the time." Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman lowered his tablet. Two college students paused their conversation. A retired couple exchanged uncertain looks. No one spoke. A flight attendant named Nicole noticed the growing attention and hurried down the aisle wearing the practice smile Airline's trained into every crew member. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Emily answered before Marcus could open his mouth. "Yes," she said. "This gentleman insists this is his seat." Nicole looked directly at Marcus instead of Emily. Her eyes traveled from his sneakers to his jacket before settling on the boarding pass he held. "May I see your ticket, sir?" Marcus handed it over without hesitation. Nicole examined it for only a second before looking back at him instead of the document. "Please wait here," she said. Emily leaned back deeper into the leather seat, folding her arms with quiet satisfaction. "I told you," she whispered just loudly enough for others to hear. "You can't simply sit wherever you feel like it." Marcus remained standing in the aisle, composed and silent, while passengers watched the exchange unfold. A young flight attendant farther back frowned as she glanced toward the digital passenger manifest on her tablet, hesitating as though something did not match. She opened her mouth, then stopped herself. The aircraft door remained open. Boarding continued. Outside the window, baggage carts rolled across the ramp beneath the fading afternoon light. Inside the cabin, however, something far heavier than luggage had just been placed into the aisle. It was assumption. And before Flight 728 ever reached the runway, that assumption was about to cost far more than a first-class seat. Nicole held Marcus Carter's boarding pass a little longer than necessary, studying the printed information with narrowed eyes even though everything on the document appeared perfectly ordinary. The barcode was intact. The flight number matched. Seat 2A was clearly printed beside his name. Still, instead of handing it back, she looked at Marcus again, almost as though she expected his appearance to contradict the facts in her hand. "Please remain where you are while I verify something," she said politely, although her tone carried the quiet certainty that he was the one who needed proving. Marcus simply nodded. "Take your time." Emily Dawson smiled toward the passengers across the aisle. "See," she said with a small shrug. "Airlines deal with this all the time." A few people nodded without knowing why. Others remained silent, uncomfortable with how quickly the conversation had shifted from a seating question to an assumption about the man standing calmly beside the row. The younger flight attendant standing several rows back continued studying the electronic passenger list on her tablet. Her name tag read Olivia Brooks. She quietly refreshed the manifest once, then again. Seat 2A still displayed the same name she had seen moments earlier. Marcus Carter. She glanced toward Nicole, hesitating before taking a cautious step forward. "Nicole," she began softly, "I think the manifest." Nicole interrupted without even turning around. "I have this under control." Olivia stopped speaking. Years of airline hierarchy had taught her when senior crew members expected silence. Marcus noticed the exchange, but said nothing. He simply folded his hands in front of him, patient enough that even the businessman across the aisle began watching with growing curiosity. Emily settled deeper into the leather seat and reached for the complimentary bottle of water waiting in the storage compartment. "I have a connection in Los Angeles," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I would really appreciate it if we did not delay departure over something that should be obvious." Nicole gave Emily a reassuring smile before facing Marcus again. "Sir, do you have another form of identification?" Marcus reached into his wallet and handed her his Illinois driver's license without complaint. Nicole examined it briefly before comparing it to the boarding pass. The names matched perfectly. She frowned anyway. "Please wait one more moment." Marcus offered a calm smile. "Of course." The businessman finally spoke from across the aisle. "If the name matches and the seat matches, what exactly are we waiting for?" Nicole answered with practiced professionalism. "We simply need to ensure every passenger is seated correctly before departure." Emily nodded approvingly, as though the explanation settled everything. Olivia looked back at her tablet once more. The digital seat map had not changed. Marcus Carter remained assigned to 2A. Emily Dawson was listed several rows behind in premium economy. Olivia felt her stomach tighten. She knew what she was seeing. She also knew that speaking again meant contradicting a senior crew member in front of passengers. The aircraft continued filling with travelers rolling carry-on bags into overhead bins, while conversations slowly resumed around the cabin. Yet an uneasy feeling lingered in the air. It was no longer about a seat assignment. It was about how easily certainty had formed before anyone bothered to verify the truth. Marcus stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, calm, respectful, and unshaken, while every passing second quietly exposed which people were relying on evidence and which were relying on appearances. Olivia Brooks could not ignore the screen any longer. She took another careful step toward Nicole, holding the airline tablet close to her chest as though it carried something fragile. "Nicole," she said quietly, "the passenger manifest still shows Mr. Carter assigned to seat 2 Alpha." Nicole barely glanced at the display before answering. "The system is sometimes slow to update during boarding." Olivia hesitated. "I refreshed it 3 times." Nicole's smile disappeared for only a moment. "Then refresh it a 4th time." Emily Dawson folded her arms and let out an exaggerated sigh. "This is becoming ridiculous," she said, looking around the cabin as if asking the other passengers for sympathy. "Some people just refuse to accept that they made a mistake." Marcus Carter remained exactly where he stood. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He simply watched the conversation unfold with the same calm expression that had never left his face. Across the aisle, the businessman who had questioned the delay earlier leaned forward again. "Has anyone actually asked the lady for her boarding pass?" The question seemed to hang in the air longer than expected. Nicole answered without looking at Emily. "We have already gathered enough information for now." The businessman frowned. "Respectfully, it sounds like only one passenger has been asked to prove anything." A few nearby travelers exchanged uncertain glances. A young mother seated 2 rows back quietly whispered to her husband, who looked toward Marcus before looking away again. Nobody seemed comfortable, yet very few people wanted to become part of the situation. Emily noticed the growing attention and immediately changed her tone. "I travel every week," she said confidently. "I know exactly how these situations happen. Someone reads the wrong seat number, and suddenly everyone else has to wait." She smiled toward Nicole. "Thank you for handling this professionally." Nicole nodded politely, almost instinctively accepting Emily's version of events without requesting a single document from her. Olivia looked from her tablet to Emily, then back to Marcus. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore. Every piece of airline data supported Marcus. Every assumption inside the cabin seemed to favor Emily. The difference unsettled her more with every passing second. Another passenger finally spoke from several rows behind. "If there is confusion, why not check both boarding passes?" A few quiet voices agreed. Nicole answered before Emily had the chance. "There is no need to inconvenience every passenger involved." Marcus finally broke his silence. His voice remained measured and respectful. "Actually, I would welcome that solution." Every eye shifted toward him. "Please verify both tickets," he continued. Facts usually settle questions much faster than assumptions. His words carried no accusation, only quiet confidence. Emily laughed softly, though her smile tightened around the edges. You really think this is about facts? She asked. Sometimes people simply need to recognize when they are in the wrong place. Marcus met her eyes without changing his expression. That is true, he replied. Eventually, everyone ends up exactly where they belong. The sentence landed gently, yet something about it caused the businessman across the aisle to smile. Olivia lowered her eyes to the glowing tablet one more time. The seat map had still not changed. Marcus Carter remained assigned to 2 Alpha. Emily Dawson remained assigned to row 9. The evidence had never moved. Only the opinions inside the cabin had. Outside the aircraft, the last baggage cart rolled away from the cargo hold as the boarding door prepared to close. Inside, however, the flight had quietly transformed into something far more revealing than a routine departure. It had become a test of who trusted verified truth and who trusted appearances first. The cabin doors remained open, but the atmosphere inside had already closed around a conclusion that no one had earned. Nicole slipped Marcus Carter's boarding pass into the pocket of her uniform instead of returning it, then reached for the interphone mounted beside the forward galley. "I need the purser in first class," she said calmly. Her words were professional. The assumptions beneath them were not. Less than a minute later, Daniel Reynolds, the senior purser, walked into the cabin with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to resolving disagreements before they became delays. He looked first at Emily Dawson sitting comfortably in seat 2 Alpha, then at Marcus standing quietly in the aisle. Without asking a single question, his attention settled on Marcus. "Sir," Daniel began, "I understand there has been some confusion regarding seating." Marcus answered with the same calm voice he had used since boarding. "There is no confusion on my end. I simply requested the seat printed on my boarding pass." Daniel nodded politely, but never asked to see the document. "We appreciate your patience. Perhaps we can find another first-class seat that will make everyone comfortable." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Another seat?" Daniel smiled as though offering a generous compromise. "Sometimes flexibility keeps the flight on schedule." Emily looked around the cabin with an expression that almost invited agreement. "Exactly," she said. "Some people care more about making a point than solving a problem." A quiet murmur drifted through the nearby rows. The businessman across the aisle spoke again. "Why should the passenger assigned to the seat be the one expected to move?" Daniel turned politely toward him. "Sir, we are simply trying to de-escalate the situation." "By moving the verified passenger?" the businessman replied. Daniel offered no direct answer. Olivia Brooks stood near the galley holding her tablet a little tighter. The electronic manifest still displayed Marcus Carter in seat 2 Alpha, but every decision being made inside the cabin seemed to ignore the information glowing in her hands. She wanted to speak again. Instead, she watched another opportunity disappear beneath the weight of seniority. Emily slowly removed her handbag from the empty seat beside her and placed it on her lap, as though claiming every inch of the row. "Honestly," she said with a dismissive laugh, "people should sit where they belong instead of creating scenes." Several passengers lowered their eyes. Others stared at Marcus, waiting to see whether his composure would finally break. It never did. He remained perfectly still, his expression almost unreadable. "May I have my boarding pass back?" he asked Nicole. She hesitated before answering. "We will return it after we finish our review." Marcus gave a slight nod. "So at the moment, I cannot even hold my own ticket." No one answered. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. Outside, a ground crew employee signaled that boarding was nearly complete. Inside, time seemed to move more slowly. Every passing second deepened the imbalance. One passenger had been believed without evidence. Another had produced evidence that no one seemed willing to honor. The issue had quietly evolved beyond a seat assignment. It had become policy shaped by perception rather than proof. Marcus looked toward the aircraft windows where the late afternoon sunlight reflected across the wing. Then he turned back toward Daniel with the same steady calm. "You are asking me to surrender something that already belongs to me," he said. "I hope everyone in this cabin remembers how easily that request was made." Daniel Reynolds pressed the call button beside the forward galley, his expression composed even as the quiet tension spread through the first-class cabin. Within seconds, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Andrew Collins stepped into the aisle with the calm authority expected from someone responsible for more than 100 lives. His uniform was immaculate, his posture confident, and his arrival immediately silenced the remaining whispers among the passengers. He looked first at Daniel, then at Nicole, and finally at Marcus Carter. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked. Daniel answered before anyone else could speak. "We have a seating dispute that is delaying departure." Captain Collins nodded once before turning toward Marcus. "Sir, I understand there has been a misunderstanding. I would appreciate your cooperation so we can push back on schedule." Marcus remained perfectly still. "I have cooperated from the moment I boarded. I presented my boarding pass, my identification, and answered every question. I am still waiting for someone to verify the other passenger's seat assignment." Captain Collins glanced briefly toward Emily Dawson, but never requested her boarding pass. Instead, he looked back at Marcus. "Sometimes the fastest solution is not the perfect one." Marcus answered quietly. "The fastest solution would have been checking both tickets 5 minutes ago." Emily let out a soft laugh and shook her head. "Captain, I really do not understand why this has become such a production. I have already settled into my seat. Surely the airline can accommodate one passenger somewhere else." The words floated through the cabin with remarkable confidence, and several travelers exchanged uncomfortable looks. The businessman across the aisle folded his arms. "It is interesting," he said calmly, "that everyone keeps asking one passenger to compromise while the other passenger has not been asked to prove anything." Captain Collins offered the practiced smile of someone trying to preserve order. "Sir, we appreciate your concern, but our crew is handling the situation." "Are they?" the businessman replied. Olivia Brooks lowered her tablet for a moment before gathering enough courage to step closer. "Captain," she said carefully, "the electronic manifest still lists Mr. Carter in seat 2 Alpha." Daniel immediately answered for him. "Olivia, thank you. We will review the system after departure." She looked down again, disappointment washing across her face. The evidence had been acknowledged only to be postponed. Marcus noticed the exchange without changing his expression. He had seen organizations delay uncomfortable facts before. Delay often became denial when no one challenged it. Nicole finally removed the boarding pass from her uniform pocket, but continued holding it instead of returning it. Marcus watched the small piece of paper in her hand with quiet patience. It represented nothing more than a confirmed reservation, yet somehow it had become something he was expected to earn all over again. Outside the windows, the jet bridge remained connected while a ramp supervisor glanced toward the aircraft, clearly wondering why boarding had stalled. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt heavier with every passing minute. No one was shouting. No one was causing a disturbance. Yet the imbalance had become impossible to ignore. One person's confidence had been accepted as proof. Another person's proof had been treated like suspicion. Marcus slowly looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers who had begun questioning what they were witnessing. Then he returned his attention to the captain. "You believe this is about keeping the flight on time," he said with quiet certainty. It stopped being about the schedule the moment evidence became less important than assumption. Captain Andrew Collins drew a slow breath before looking at Daniel Reynolds. The exchange between them lasted only a second, but it was enough for every experienced traveler in the cabin to recognize that a decision had already been made. It was simply waiting to be announced. Daniel straightened his jacket and turned toward Marcus Carter with a measured tone reserved for difficult conversations. "Sir, in the interest of avoiding further delays, we are asking you to accept another first-class seat on today's flight." Marcus remained composed. "Which seat?" Daniel hesitated. "We will determine that once everyone has boarded." Marcus looked toward the occupied seat beside the window. "So you are asking me to surrender a confirmed seat for one that does not currently exist?" No one answered immediately. Emily Dawson crossed her arms with quiet satisfaction. "Some people would rather make everyone late than admit they are wrong," she said, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. A few uncomfortable faces turned toward Marcus again, waiting for some emotional reaction that never came. Nicole still held his boarding pass. Marcus extended his hand politely. "I would like my ticket returned." Nicole tightened her grip slightly before responding. "We are retaining it until this matter is resolved." Marcus slowly lowered his hand. "You are retaining proof that the seat belongs to me while asking me to abandon it." The words settled over the cabin with remarkable clarity. Across the aisle, the businessman shook his head. "That does not sound reasonable." Captain Collins answered without looking at him. "Sir, We appreciate your patience, but we must move forward. Olivia Brooks looked down at the airline tablet once more. The passenger manifest remained unchanged. Marcus Carter, Seat 2 Alpha. Emily Dawson, Row 9. The glowing screen had become almost painful to read because every fact it displayed was being quietly ignored. Gathering her courage again, Olivia stepped toward the captain. "Captain," she said carefully, "there has to be another way. The manifest is still showing the original assignment." Daniel answered before the captain could speak. "Olivia, thank you. Please continue assisting with boarding." She nodded reluctantly, but her expression revealed growing concern. She was watching policy drift farther away from evidence with every passing moment. The boarding door remained open as the final passengers found their seats. Outside the aircraft windows, a fuel truck slowly pulled away while a gate agent glanced toward the cockpit, clearly wondering why departure had not yet begun. Inside, the silence had become heavier than conversation. Marcus slipped his phone from his jacket pocket and glanced at the screen without unlocking it. Then he calmly returned it to his pocket. The simple movement caught Olivia's attention, though no one else appeared to notice. Emily smiled faintly. "Finally accepting reality?" she asked. Marcus looked at her with the same steady expression he had worn since the first moment they met. "Reality has been present from the beginning," he replied. "It simply has not been acknowledged." Captain Collins folded his arms. "Sir, if we cannot resolve this voluntarily, we may have to involve airport operations." Marcus gave a slight nod, neither threatened nor surprised. "You should involve everyone you believe is necessary," he said quietly. "Just make certain every decision made today is documented exactly as it happened." Something in the calm certainty of his voice caused the businessman to lean back in silence and Olivia to look up from her tablet once more. For the first time since boarding began, it no longer felt as though Marcus was waiting for the crew to discover the truth. It felt as though he was patiently allowing them to reveal themselves. For the first time since boarding began, no one spoke. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of luggage being loaded beneath the aircraft. Marcus Carter lowered his eyes for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in reflection. The scene before him was painfully familiar. 23 years earlier, he had stood inside another airport wearing an inexpensive navy blazer he had saved months to buy for his first corporate interview in Seattle. He still remembered the gate agent looking past him toward the white businessman standing behind him, assuming the other passenger belonged in the priority boarding lane while asking Marcus to step aside. He had shown his ticket twice that morning. The answer had never changed. "Please wait while we verify your information." He had waited nearly 40 minutes while other passengers boarded without a single question. By the time the mistake was finally acknowledged, no apology erased the feeling of being judged before being known. That day, sitting alone in the last row of the aircraft, Marcus promised himself something that had shaped every decision afterward. He would never spend his life trying to convince strangers that he belonged. He would build a future where facts carried more weight than assumptions. Years passed. Long nights became successful investments. Successful investments became companies. Companies became thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on decisions made with fairness instead of appearances. Yet standing in this first-class aisle, watching his own boarding pass remain in someone else's hand while another passenger occupied his assigned seat, Marcus realized that wealth had changed many things, but not every first impression. His expression never hardened. If anything, it became calmer. Anger would only distract from the truth already unfolding in front of dozens of witnesses. Across the cabin, Olivia Brooks noticed the subtle change in his eyes. It was not frustration. It was acceptance, the kind that came from someone who had survived this lesson before and no longer needed to prove himself to people determined not to listen. The businessman across the aisle quietly removed his glasses and folded them in his lap, continuing to observe without interruption. Even Emily Dawson stopped smiling for a brief second, unsettled by the complete absence of emotion she had expected to provoke. Captain Andrew Collins glanced toward the open aircraft door, clearly aware that departure was slipping farther behind schedule. Daniel Reynolds shifted his weight uneasily, while Nicole still held the boarding pass that should never have left Marcus's possession. None of them realized that the quiet man standing before them had already measured this moment against decades of experience. Marcus slowly looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers one by one before speaking in a voice barely louder than ordinary conversation. "There is something I learned a long time ago," he said. "When people decide who belongs before they examine the evidence, they are not testing the person standing in front of them. They are revealing themselves." No one answered. The words settled gently across the cabin, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any argument. Outside the window, the evening sun reflected across the polished wing, while inside the aircraft, every passing second carried the crew farther away from a simple seating mistake and closer to a decision that would define far more than a delayed departure. The silence lingered only a few seconds before Marcus Carter reached into his jacket and unlocked his phone. His movements were so ordinary that almost no one paid attention. Emily Dawson rolled her eyes. "Calling customer service is not going to change anything," she said with a confident smile. "They're going to tell you exactly what the crew already has." Marcus did not answer her. He selected a single contact and lifted the phone to his ear. The call connected almost immediately. "Rachel," he said calmly, "please activate Protocol 7. There was no urgency in his voice. No explanation. Just 6 quiet words spoken with complete certainty. On the other end, Rachel Bennett answered without hesitation. "Understood, Mr. Carter. Confirming Protocol 7 activation now." Marcus replied, "Please document every decision made since boarding began. Include the passenger manifest, the seating records, and the time each crew member became involved." Rachel's voice remained steady. "Already in progress. The operational log has been preserved. Would you like me to notify executive flight operations?" Marcus looked toward the cockpit door before answering. "Not yet. Give them exactly one opportunity to correct this on their own." Rachel paused only briefly. "Understood. I will prepare the escalation package and remain available." Marcus ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The conversation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Emily laughed quietly. "That was dramatic," she said. "Did you think using corporate language would scare anyone?" Nicole exchanged a brief glance with Daniel Reynolds. Neither of them recognized the phrase Protocol 7, but something about Marcus's confidence unsettled them. Captain Andrew Collins noticed the same thing, though he quickly dismissed it. "Sir," he said politely, "if you have contacted customer relations, they will address your concerns after the flight." Marcus shook his head once. "I did not contact customer relations." He offered nothing further. Olivia Brooks watched him carefully. She had worked for the airline long enough to know that internal procedures often carried numbered names, especially those involving compliance and executive operations. The phrase echoed in her mind with growing unease. She quietly refreshed the electronic manifest once again. This time a small notification briefly appeared at the top of the screen before disappearing almost as quickly as it had arrived. "System synchronization in progress." Olivia frowned. She had never seen that message appear during ordinary boarding. The businessman across the aisle noticed her expression. "Everything all right?" he asked softly. Olivia hesitated before answering. "I am not sure anymore." Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge remained connected even though every scheduled boarding task had been completed. A gate supervisor looked toward the cockpit through the terminal window, waiting for authorization to begin pushback. Inside the cabin, however, an invisible process had already begun moving through systems no passenger could see. Rachel Bennett sat hundreds of miles away inside a quiet executive office, reviewing digital records appearing one after another across multiple monitors. Boarding data, crew communications, passenger manifests, access logs, timestamps. Every action taken inside the aircraft was being preserved exactly as it happened. Marcus remained standing in the aisle with the same calm expression he had worn from the beginning. He did not look like a man preparing for confrontation. He looked like someone patiently waiting for facts to arrive before judgment. No one in the cabin realized that while they were still debating one first-class seat, events far beyond the aircraft door had already begun quietly moving toward them. Captain Andrew Collins had just turned toward the cockpit when the phone clipped to his belt vibrated once, then again before he could take another step. He frowned, glanced at the caller identification, and immediately answered. Captain Collins speaking. The confidence in his voice lasted only a moment. "Yes, operations," he said. His expression slowly changed as he listened. Daniel Reynolds noticed it first. Nicole noticed it next. Emily Dawson continued sitting comfortably in seat 2 Alpha, completely unaware that every eye inside the first-class cabin was beginning to shift away from Marcus Carter and toward the captain. "I understand," Captain Collins replied carefully. "You are asking me to verify the identity of the passenger involved?" A brief silence followed. "Yes, he is standing here now." Another pause. Then the captain's shoulders stiffened. "I was not aware of that information." Daniel stepped closer. "Captain." Collins raised one finger, asking him to wait while he continued listening. "Confirmed. Passenger name Marcus Carter. You are requesting immediate compliance review before departure." His voice had become noticeably quieter. Olivia Brooks watched the exchange without blinking. The notification that had briefly appeared on her tablet moments earlier returned, this time remaining on the screen. Executive Operations Synchronization Complete. Crew Review Pending. She had never seen those words before. Nicole felt a knot forming in her stomach. Emily looked from one face to another, confused by the sudden change in mood. "What is going on?" she asked with an uneasy laugh. No one answered her. Captain Collins slowly lowered the phone from his ear. Before anyone could ask another question, it rang again. He looked at the display and answered immediately. "Yes." This time the call lasted less than 20 seconds. "Understood. We will remain at the gate." He ended the call and looked directly at Marcus for the first time since boarding began. Not at his clothes. Not at the boarding pass. At him. The confidence that had defined the captain only minutes earlier had quietly given way to caution. Daniel Reynolds stepped closer. "Captain, what is happening?" Collins spoke slowly, choosing every word with care. "Executive Flight Operations has instructed this aircraft to remain at the gate until further notice." Emily laughed nervously. "Over a seating issue." The captain did not respond. Olivia glanced down again. Another notification appeared beneath the first. "Corporate compliance session active. Do not depart." Her heartbeat quickened. Nicole instinctively reached into her uniform pocket and looked at the boarding pass she had been holding since the beginning of the dispute. For the first time, she seemed uncertain whether she should still be holding it at all. Marcus remained exactly where he had stood throughout the entire encounter. Calm, unhurried, unshaken. He finally extended his hand once more. "May I have my boarding pass back now?" Nicole hesitated only a second before placing it into his hand. Marcus accepted it without triumph or satisfaction. He simply looked at the familiar piece of paper before sliding it carefully into his jacket pocket. Captain Collins took one slow breath. "Mr. Carter," he said respectfully, "Executive Flight Operations has asked us to confirm your identity." Marcus met his eyes with quiet composure. "I assumed they eventually would." The captain nodded slightly. "May I ask who you are?" Marcus answered without raising his voice. "You spent the last several minutes asking where I belonged." He paused just long enough for the silence to settle across the cabin. "Now it is time to ask whether your airline knows who is standing in front of you." The question lingered in the cabin long enough for every passenger to feel its weight. Captain Andrew Collins stood motionless, waiting for an answer that suddenly seemed far more important than the delayed departure displayed on the gate monitor outside. Marcus Carter looked around the first-class cabin before speaking. "My name is Marcus Carter," he said calmly. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Horizon Air Group and the largest individual shareholder of this airline." No one reacted at first. The words were almost too simple for the moment they carried. Emily Dawson stared at him before letting out a nervous laugh. "That is impossible," she said. "If you were really the Chief Executive Officer, everyone would recognize you." Marcus offered no reply. He did not need one. Captain Collins's phone rang again. This time he answered before the first vibration had ended. "Yes," he said quietly. His face lost what little color remained. "Understood. I will comply immediately." He lowered the phone with slow, deliberate movements before looking directly at Daniel Reynolds. "Executive Operations has confirmed Mr. Carter's identity." The words struck the cabin harder than any raised voice could have. Daniel blinked once, as though he had misheard. Nicole instinctively covered her mouth with one hand. Olivia Brooks looked down at her tablet, where the passenger record had changed again. A gold executive designation now appeared beside Marcus Carter's name, followed by authorization codes she had never seen before. Emily's smile disappeared completely. "There has to be some mistake," she whispered. "I have flown this airline for years." Marcus looked toward her with quiet composure. "Years of flying do not grant ownership," he replied. "They simply make someone a customer." The businessman across the aisle slowly smiled and leaned back in his seat. I had a feeling the facts were going to matter eventually. Captain Collins straightened his uniform before speaking again. Mr. Carter, on behalf of this flight crew, I sincerely apologize for what has occurred. Marcus listened without interrupting. Daniel Reynolds lowered his eyes. I should have verified both boarding passes before making any decision. Nicole swallowed hard before stepping forward. I never should have kept your boarding pass. I should have returned it immediately. Olivia finally spoke with confidence. The manifest showed the correct assignment from the beginning. No one challenged her this time. Emily looked around the cabin searching for support, but the sympathetic expressions she had enjoyed only minutes earlier were gone. Several passengers quietly looked away. Others looked directly at her, not with anger, but with disappointment. Marcus folded his boarding pass and slipped it back into his jacket. The problem was never that you did not know my title, he said calmly. The problem was how quickly evidence stopped matching once you decided what kind of passenger you believed I was. His words settled across the cabin with unmistakable clarity. No one argued. No one offered another excuse. The quiet that followed felt completely different from the silence that had filled the aircraft earlier. Before, it had been built on assumption. Now it rested on undeniable truth. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge remained attached, ground crews waiting for instructions that had not yet come. Inside, every member of the flight crew understood that the delayed departure was no longer the most important consequence of the afternoon. The real reckoning had only just begun. Captain Andrew Collins looked toward the open cockpit door, then back at Marcus Carter, waiting for instructions that only minutes earlier he could not have imagined taking from the quiet passenger he had nearly asked to surrender his own seat. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not celebrate being proven right. Instead, he reached into his pocket, unlocked his phone, and placed a brief call. Rachel Bennett answered immediately. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." Marcus spoke with the same calm precision that had defined every word since boarding. "Rachel, authorize an immediate operational hold on Flight 728. No pushback. No departure. Initiate a Level 1 compliance review before this aircraft leaves the gate." Rachel replied without hesitation. "Authorization confirmed. Flight 728 is now officially grounded pending executive review. Airport operations, corporate compliance, and human resources have all been notified. Electronic access records have been preserved." Captain Collins felt his phone vibrate almost instantly. He looked at the screen, read the notification, and slowly closed his eyes for a brief second before showing it to Daniel Reynolds. The message contained only a few lines, but every word carried enormous weight. Executive Directive. Aircraft grounded. Crew compliance review effective immediately. Daniel quietly lowered his head. Nicole stared at the floor, realizing the consequences had become real. Emily Dawson looked around the cabin in disbelief. "You actually stopped the flight?" she asked, her voice no longer confident. Marcus looked at her calmly. "The flight is not delayed because of one seat," he answered. "It is delayed because verified facts were ignored while assumptions guided decisions." No one challenged him. Olivia Brooks received her own notification a moment later. Her tablet displayed instructions directing her to preserve all digital records exactly as they existed at the time of boarding. She looked at Marcus with a mixture of surprise and quiet respect. The businessman across the aisle smiled gently. "Sometimes accountability arrives before takeoff," he said. Marcus nodded once before turning toward Captain Collins. "Captain, this review is not about punishment for an honest mistake. Honest mistakes are corrected the moment evidence appears." This continued long after the evidence was available. Captain Collins accepted the observation without argument. "You are correct," he admitted. "We failed to follow our own standards." Daniel spoke next. "I asked the verified passenger to move instead of verifying the unverified claim. There is no excuse for that decision." Nicole swallowed hard. "I held your boarding pass when it should have remained in your possession. That should never happen to any passenger." Marcus listened carefully before answering. "Policies only matter when they protect every traveler equally. Otherwise, they become convenient words printed in employee manuals." Emily slowly stood from seat 2 Alpha, looking more uncertain than she had at any point since boarding. She quietly picked up her handbag and stepped into the aisle without being asked. "I should have checked my boarding pass," she said softly. "Instead, I assumed I belonged there." Marcus met her eyes. Everyone makes mistakes. The difference is whether we allow pride to keep them alive. The cabin remained silent as airport operations personnel appeared at the aircraft door, not rushing, not creating a scene, simply carrying out the executive directive that had already taken effect. Flight 728 would not leave the gate until every decision made inside that cabin had been reviewed, documented, and understood. For the first time that afternoon, every person on board realized that the most important destination was no longer Los Angeles. It was accountability. Airport operations entered the aircraft with quiet professionalism, carrying tablets instead of authority in their hands. There were no raised voices, no dramatic announcements, and no attempt to embarrass anyone. The cabin remained remarkably still, as though every passenger understood that the most important lesson of the afternoon was unfolding in complete silence. Marcus Carter stepped slightly aside to allow the operations team into the aisle before taking his assigned seat, now finally vacant after Emily Dawson had quietly moved away. He placed his boarding pass on the armrest beside him and looked out the window for a brief moment before turning back toward the crew. Captain Andrew Collins approached first. His posture was different now. The certainty that had once rested on assumption had been replaced by deliberate humility. "Mr. Carter," he said sincerely, "I know an apology cannot erase what happened today, but I hope you will accept that every member of this crew has learned something we should never have needed to learn this way." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Learning is valuable only when it changes tomorrow's decisions," he replied. "Otherwise, it becomes another speech people forget before the next flight." Daniel Reynolds stood beside the captain and spoke with quiet honesty. "When I saw two passengers disagreeing over one seat, I believed I was resolving a delay. I never stopped to ask why every request for proof was directed toward the same person." Marcus looked at him calmly. "Bias rarely introduces itself by name. It often arrives disguised as efficiency." Nicole lowered her eyes before speaking. "I thought I was following procedure." Marcus answered gently. "Procedure begins with verification. What happened today began with assumption." Olivia Brooks remained near the forward galley holding her tablet against her uniform. Marcus turned toward her with a faint smile. "You kept checking the facts even when no one wanted to hear them." Olivia seemed surprised that he had noticed. "I almost stopped speaking because I thought I was overstepping." Marcus shook his head. "Integrity often feels like overstepping when everyone else has already decided they are correct." The businessman across the aisle smiled quietly. "That may be the most important thing said on this flight today." Several nearby passengers nodded in agreement. Emily Dawson stood a few rows behind them, holding her boarding pass with both hands. She slowly walked forward until she reached Marcus. "I cannot undo what I assumed about you," she said softly. "I looked at your clothes before I looked at the facts. I am sorry." Marcus met her eyes without resentment. "The seat was never the real issue," he replied. "Seats can be reassigned. Delayed flights eventually depart. What takes much longer to repair is the habit of deciding who belongs before asking for the truth." The words settled gently across the cabin. No one argued because there was nothing left to defend. Every passenger had watched the same events unfold. Every member of the crew now understood that the evidence had been available from the beginning. The failure had never been technology. It had never been policy. It had been the willingness to trust appearance before verification. Outside the window, the evening sky had begun turning shades of orange and blue while the aircraft remained quietly connected to the jet bridge. Inside, something far more meaningful than a schedule had changed. A lesson that began with one first-class seat had become a reminder that dignity should never depend on clothing, confidence, or first impressions. It should begin with the simple decision to let facts speak before assumptions ever have the chance. The review concluded just before sunset, and the cabin felt different from the one Marcus Carter had entered less than an hour earlier. The conversations were quieter. The expressions were humbler. Even the air seemed lighter now that truth no longer had to compete with assumption. Airport operations confirmed that the compliance review would continue after the aircraft returned to the terminal later that evening, with every report, every digital record, and every statement preserved exactly as they had occurred. Captain Andrew Collins addressed the passengers over the intercom, his voice steady but unmistakably sincere. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience today. We apologize for the delay. We are committed to ensuring that every passenger is treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. Those standards are not optional. They are the foundation of this airline. When the announcement ended, no one applauded. They simply listened. Sometimes silence carried more respect than noise ever could. Marcus remained seated in 2 Alpha, looking out across the runway where the evening lights had begun reflecting against the pavement. He remembered the younger version of himself standing at another airport decades earlier, wondering whether he would spend his entire life trying to prove that he belonged in rooms where others were welcomed without question. He smiled faintly, not because he had won an argument, but because he had kept a promise to that younger man. He had never allowed bitterness to become his identity. He had built something stronger instead. Olivia Brooks walked toward him before returning to her duties. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marcus looked up. "For what?" She smiled. "For reminding me that speaking up is part of my job too." Marcus nodded. Never confuse respect for authority with silence in the face of facts. She carried those words with her as she walked back through the cabin. The businessman across the aisle gathered his briefcase before leaning toward Marcus. "You could have revealed who you were the moment you boarded." Marcus smiled. "If I had, everyone would have treated the title with respect. I needed to know whether they would treat the passenger with respect." The man slowly nodded, understanding the difference. Emily Dawson paused before leaving the first-class cabin, turning back one final time. "I hope I remember today for the right reason," she said softly. Marcus answered without hesitation. "Then remember the lesson, not the embarrassment." She gave a quiet nod and continued down the aisle. A few minutes later, airport operations cleared the aircraft for departure. The jet bridge slowly pulled away from the cabin door, and the aircraft finally began preparing for pushback. Yet everyone on board knew the journey had truly begun long before the engine started. It had begun the moment one assumption challenged one undeniable fact. As the airplane rolled away from the gate, Marcus looked once more across the cabin that had unknowingly tested its own values. He had not needed to raise his voice. He had not needed to demand respect. He had simply allowed every decision to reveal itself until the truth became impossible to ignore. The runway stretched ahead beneath the fading evening sky, and the aircraft moved forward with a renewed sense of purpose. Marcus quietly closed his eyes for a moment before looking out the window again, knowing that real leadership was never about reminding people who held power. It was about building a world where no one had to reveal power before receiving basic dignity. That was the destination worth protecting, and unlike any flight schedule, it was a journey that could never afford to be delayed.